Please be seated. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Does this offend you? Now, we've spent several weeks talking about Jesus and the bread of life in John. By now, you might be tired of it, or maybe even a little numb to the message. We aren't sitting there in that synagogue with Jesus, so the impact of his words can feel dulled by the passage of time. But imagine for a moment hearing those words for the first time. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. Does it shock you? Or have we become too comfortable with this metaphor, explaining it away as merely symbolic of the Eucharist? But John's gospel doesn't present this as a mere symbol. It's more than a ritual. It's an invitation into something shocking, something that should unsettle us if we let it sink in. Jesus repeats this command over and over in chapter 6. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. And if we don't feel at least a little uncomfortable, then maybe we have missed the point. When Jesus asks, does that offend you? The Greek word here is actually scandalizo. Yes, that's the root word for scandalized. Jesus didn't soften his message even when many of his followers walked away. He didn't backpedal or offer a gentler version. He let his words stand, knowing full well they were hard to accept. Imagine if Jesus walked into our church today and said something equally shocking like he did in that synagogue in Capernaum. Would we be offended? Who among us would walk away? Who would stay? See, sometimes we need to hear shocking news to be startled out of our familiar patterns. Think about how it literally feels to be shocked. I mean, most of us have probably felt, I'm pretty sure everyone has felt the sting of static electricity, right? I mean, I've got certain pants and shoes I don't wear in the wintertime together. How many of you have actually been shocked by a plug? Really? Okay, don't just nod. I want to know who's stuck the bobby pin in the plug. Okay, a few of you have an idea of what this feels like. See, when I was 2 years old, I had a shocking experience. My family was hanging out with our neighbors in the yard between our condos when my mom asked me to go turn on the water faucet. As soon as my little hand wrapped around the metal handle, I got a big shock, electrocuted due to a wiring mistake in the sprinkler system. Now, I've been told that I was too young to hold on to that memory, but trust me, I do. And I have a very personal sense of how Wile E. Coyote felt in many of the Looney Tunes moments. Jesus' words are meant to have that same kind of indelible effect. They're meant to wake us up, shaking us out of our complacency. We get comfortable with our routines and our rituals, and we forget that following Jesus is supposed to be challenging, even shocking. When we hear shocking news, most of the time our instinct is to resist. We don't like change. We don't like being pushed out of our comfort zones. Yet Jesus does just that. He never stays in one place. He just keeps moving, keeps challenging us to follow him, even when the path gets difficult. Think about the story from John's Gospel. When the crowd found Jesus' teaching too difficult, they left. But again, Jesus doesn't soften his message. Instead, he asks, does this offend you? What about us? Are we ready to be shocked by Jesus? Are we prepared to follow him even when his teachings challenge everything we think we know? Shocking news does have the power to change our lives. Sometimes, yes, we usually think about it being bad news, like a diagnosis we weren't expecting, the sudden loss of a loved one. But other times it is good news, a surprise pregnancy, a miraculous recovery, or an unexpected gift. Shocking news, whether good or bad, forces us to reassess our lives and our choices and to think about what really matters. Because God works in shocking ways. Another story. My grandfather, Papa, worked for a power company. Early in his career, he was a lineman, climbing up and down the poles to connect and disconnect the power lines. And I'm sure you all know that those power lines carry a lot more electricity than our household plugs. Can you guess where this is going? During a storm, a stray power line electrocuted Papa, and he survived. He had a scar on his arm where the power line hit him. The power traveled all the way through his body and came out his big toe. Growing up, I was always told that the only reason he survived was because all of the valves in his heart were open when the electricity hit him. Many called it a miracle. But there's more. See, Papa was electrocuted by a power line a second time and survived. My grandfather lived a long life, retired from the power company, and spent years tending his 2-acre garden. But I tell you what, as a child, I learned not to follow his example when it came to randomly rewiring a plug, because that man had no sense of scale when it came to a shock. But the funny thing is, after 2 electrocutions, my grandparents were told that they wouldn't have any more children. So they were shocked yet again when Mima discovered that she was pregnant with my mother. God defies our expectations. Sometimes we are shocked, literally and figuratively, but by what God has in store for us. Jesus' shocking message caused many to walk away, but Peter and the other disciples stayed. They chose to follow Jesus even when they didn't fully understand where he was leading them. And what a shocking ending that turned out to be. So, how do we respond to Jesus' shocking message today? Do we walk away, or do we lean into the discomfort, trusting that God truly has a plan, even when it's not what we expected it to be? Jesus is still challenging us today. He's still asking, does this offend you? Is this what you expected? And he's still calling us to abide in God, even when his words are hard to accept. Are we ready to be shocked by Jesus? To follow him even when the path is uncertain? Trusting that God is leading us toward something greater than we can ever